Did you know the plague almost wasn't added to Dead by Daylight because of her strange gimmick? Despite being one of the most unique killers in the game, Plague's addition almost never happened. During playtesting, Behavior felt her gameplay mechanics were too complicated and her aesthetics too unsettling. However, as we know, she did end up being added to the game, and has become one of Dead by Daylight's most iconic killers. No, not you, go away! Today, we're going to cover the entire history of the Plague, including why they ended up adding her, all the balance changes she has received, and how her addition influenced the game as a whole. Adiris, known as the Plague, was once a revered high priestess in ancient Babylon. She had an unwavering faith in their gods, which defined her whole existence. It was Adiris' devotion to the faith that made her end up as the high priestess, but it was also what ultimately led to her undoing. Adiris' faith demanded absolute loyalty, so when her father showed signs of blasphemy, she was put in a horrible position. She had to choose between her father or her faith. This is the first time Adiris questioned her belief. All the things they had done in the name of the gods, all the human sacrifices, could it be for nothing? After all, the gods had never responded their pleas or showed any signs of even existing. Her father, wanting them to leave Babylon and the cult behind, encouraged her to ask the gods what to do, certain that they wouldn't answer and that she would come to her senses. And ask them she did. She spent hours begging the gods for advice, an answer, or any signs of existing. As always, the gods remained silent. That is, until she heard them, the whispers. Something was calling to her, whispering words she couldn't understand. This was all she needed to hear. She couldn't understand the whispers, as they seemed to speak a foreign language, but that didn't bother her. Why would the gods speak the same language as her anyway? Surely they would have another, godly language. Her excitement quickly died down though, as she realized what this meant, what she must now do. Blasphemy was punishable by death, and while this was normally the job of the Maiden Guard, she felt it was her job to sacrifice him. After all, he was her father, and she had been the one hiding his blasphemy, going against her faith. It must be her that kills him. She steals a uniform from the Maiden's Guard, confident no one would discover her violation, knowing the gods are on her side. Dressed as one of the Maiden's Guard, she went to the temple where her father was waiting.
Adanika dingia!
She sacrificed her own father for his blasphemy. That's not to say she didn't love him though. Her faith was just stronger than her love. Though she was racked with guilt, she remained resolute, unaware that the whispers she heard were not actually from her gods, but from the entity manipulating her at her most vulnerable moments. When a deadly plague swept through Babylon, Adiris, desperate to save her people, led them into the wilderness. She hoped that leading them up a mountain would get them closer to the gods, and that their suffering would prove their faith and bring salvation. But the gods she worshipped were silent. One by one, her people succumbed to the disease, and Adiris herself began to fall victim to its ravages. As her life ebbed away, Adiris uttered one final plea, one that was finally answered. The entity was rewarding Adiris and her people for their faith, offering to save them and take Adiris to its own realm. Believing she was fulfilling her god's will, Adiris accepted the entity's offer and joined it in its realm. There, she became the Plague, continuing to kill those deemed blasphemous by the entity, unaware of how she's being manipulated. Her tragic story of faith and manipulation is central to her design, which posed unique challenges for the development team. Translating such a complex and emotionally charged backstory into a character that felt both authentic to her lore and engaging to play wasn't easy. Changing her story wasn't an option either, as at the time Behaviour were experimenting with ways to fit characters from different time epochs into the Dead by Daylight universe, and the Plague was the culmination of this work. Eventually, they landed on the idea of an infection-based ability, where her power would spread sickness to survivors. This concept aligned perfectly with her lore, but came with its own challenges. Behaviour needed to ensure it was impactful and balanced, while staying true to her character. Incorporating features like spreading disease, survivors cleansing with pools of devotion, and actively managing infection added complexity, requiring entirely new gameplay systems to support her. The idea of projectile vomiting emerged as a part of this infection mechanic, though it likely wasn't their first or only concept. While the idea stood out as a unique and fitting choice, it wasn't without risks. Behaviour worried that some players might find it too gross or off-putting, potentially driving them away from the game. They also questioned whether her sickness would come off horrifying as intended, or feel too absurd, straying from Dead by Daylight's at the time more sinister tone. Designing the Plague wasn't easy either. While the conceptual stages of giving her accurate abilities and an interesting backstory were difficult, bringing them to life shows just how good Behaviour's art team can be when they want to. The Plague's design had to not only embody her tragic backstory as a high priestess plagued by sickness, but also represent the two main pillars of her story: fear and unwavering faith. This core philosophy can be seen throughout her aesthetics. The Plague stands tall and dignified, with her ceremonial outfit highlighting her past as a high priestess. The grotesque signs of disease tell the story of her suffering, of what was the youth and what is the Plague. Even her weapon, the ceremonial censer, ties into this narrative. It's both a symbol of her faith and priestly duties, but also serves a more macabre purpose, masking the stench of her decomposing body. Designing her ability was particularly challenging. When Behaviour committed to her vomit-based ability, there were concerns about it being too gross. Finding a way for the vomit to not only look and sound good, but also not be too off-putting was a thin line to walk. However, after polling the staff, they decided to double down, allowing them to create a unique gameplay mechanic that also reinforced her narrative. The vomit symbolized the Plague spreading through her body, and also, well, I'm just gonna let Behaviour explain this one themselves.
We wanted to create a parallel with how faith spreads, but also how diseases spread.
Behaviour didn't stop there though. To really sell the Plague as a high priestess from a forgotten time, they made sure the symbols on her costumes and in the cinematics had an actual meaning. All the symbols seen relating to her and the demise of the Faithful chapter are supposedly Sumerian, an ancient and dead language used in southern Mesopotamia. Granted, this was probably someone's way of justifying researching their hobby during paid hours. However, I can't deny it's a great attention to detail that most people unfortunately never notice. It's also worth highlighting the incredible contribution of Christoph Young. His concept art really brought the Plague to life in her full beauty, elegance, and horror. Looking at the different concepts for the Plague, it's clear the standards were high for what would make the final cut. The Plague is one of many examples where Christoph Young's artistry completely carries the whole art style of Dead by Daylight. Comparing her intricate designs to more recent concept art, like The Unknown, it's clear how much of an impact this artistry had on the game's once very vivid identity. That's not to say that all modern Dead by Daylight art is bad, but rather that they've strayed far from their original vision. Bringing the Plague to life wasn't just about the aesthetics and design though. There were also significant coding challenges that came with creating her. Behaviour had to make a number of systems from scratch for her, as no previous killer mechanic involved anything like dynamically spreading status effects through survivor interactions with the environment. Mechanics like keeping infections on generators for a specific amount of time and setting the different infection progression speeds, depending on whether a survivor interacted with an infected object or another infected survivor, were particularly difficult to implement. I mean, hell, saying that is difficult enough, imagine making it. These complexities can be seen in the many bugs that ended up plaguing the Plague, pun intended. For example, her vomit would sometimes be blocked by invisible walls, rendering her ability useless in certain spots. In other cases, infection progress would stop entirely, even though survivors played the full animation for being completely infected, creating confusion and frustration for the Plague players. While these bugs are much less frequent today, they show just how intricate the code design behind her ability really was. The developers also faced a unique problem with her vomit ability. They wanted her vomit to move and feel as you would expect it, maintaining a natural flow, or at least as natural as it gets for a vomit spraying ability in a video game about putting people on hooks. However, they also couldn't make it too detailed or physics heavy, as it could easily become too demanding on the players' computers. Finding the balance between good-looking vomit and not turning people's PCs into furnaces might have been difficult, but the end result was definitely worth the process. Balancing the Plague proved to be a challenge as well. Her power is highly intricate, with many moving parts that can be adjusted to fine-tune her strength. For example, Behavior had to decide whether an infection should make survivors broken or just one hit like Wesker does, and how quickly the infection should spread depending on the circumstances. Should it progress faster if a survivor is interacting with an infected object or survivor? Should it slowly increase over time or remain the same if they're simply infected but not touching anything? Even the arc of her vomit required careful tuning. It needed to travel far enough to be practical, but not so far it felt unfair. They also had to decide how long she should have her improved ability, and how fast her movement speed should be while charging and holding her ability respectively. There are many more parts, but you get the idea. Balancing the Plague's ability wasn't as easy as determining how many traps the Trapper should have, or how long it should take for the Wraith to uncloak. Given the complexity of her design, Behavior took a cautious approach when releasing the Plague. To ensure she didn't feel overpowered, they had to launch her in a relatively weak state. While it prevented her from dominating matches, it instead made her feel very underwhelming compared to other killers. Over time, Behavior has gradually buffed her, tweaking her ability to make her more competitive without breaking the game's balance. Just how many challenges Behavior took on with making this character shows how ambitious they used to be. Taking the risks to create the completely new mechanics for just a single character, designing her to such a detailed degree without knowing she would be a hit, and all the balance struggles they ultimately risked is a true testament to the dedication they once had. When the Plague was first introduced in the public test build, PTB, Behavior took an understandably cautious approach with her balancing, which resulted in her releasing in a notably weak state. This left many players disappointed, as her mechanics seemed so intriguing. This approach wasn't entirely unexpected though, as it is easier to buff a killer after initial feedback than to launch them too strong and risk backlash. And buff her they did. Between the PTB and her official release, the Plague received what is arguably the most significant patch she would ever receive. Her Corrupt Purge, the vomit that deals direct damage, had its duration increased by 33%, making it easier to get proper value out of it. As before, survivors could simply hide and wait for the ability to run out if they heard this sound effect. The infection time on objects was also extended by 75%, giving her more map control. On top of that, her movement speed while charging her vomit was slightly increased, and survivors would no longer cleanse their infections automatically when being hooked. These changes all made her ability much more viable and impactful, yet not overtuning her like giving her infinite Corrupt Purge or much faster infection speed would have. Granted, they did slightly reduce the Plague's movement speed while specifically holding her ability, which means having the ability bar maxed out and the actual vomiting part. While they didn't specify any numbers, it's safe to assume she moved at normal movement speed before the nerf, as it's now 110%, only 5% slower than normal. Unfortunately, it is impossible to accurately see how this affected her pick and kill rate in games, as Behavior didn't show any official statistics at the time, and to this day still offer no API to see these types of stats. The closest I could find was a forum post from 8 months after her debut, where she was shown to have the lowest pick rate in the whole game. This is despite her kill rate being above average, suggesting that while the Plague was a strong character once you learned her, the unique mechanics were challenging to understand and effectively use for players at the time. This was also at a time where characters like the Spirit and the Nurse were particularly problematic and had yet to be nerfed, further pushing the Plague down into obscurity. There were some smaller quality of life patches, like improving her score in the brutality category, but the next real buff would come in 2021. Patch 5.3.0 brought buffs and quality of life improvements to the Plague. According to Behavior, these changes aimed to provide a general buff and make her abilities smoother and more intuitive. A key adjustment was made to her Vile Purge, making it continue to charge until a minimum threshold was met, even if the ability button was released early. This was due to an issue with players wanting to make a short purge and accidentally cancelling the ability as they held the button a tiny bit too short. More significant buffs included increasing her cooldown movement speed after a Vile Purge by 56%. This made it much less punishing to miss the ability, resulting in a more beginner-friendly gameplay loop that was easier to pick up for newer players. They also extended the infection duration on objects by 14% and raised the time it takes for survivors to cleanse by 33%. All in all, these changes made her a bit easier to use and her infections a bit more oppressive, whilst not making her much stronger in the hands of experienced players. This was a perfect change, as the main issue with the Plague has been her pick rate, not her overall strength. If we take a look at her pick and kill rates after the patch, we can see that the changes significantly boosted her pick rate while keeping her kill rate roughly the same compared to launch. Her pick rate climbed from 1.6% to 3.1%, and her kill rate stayed around its original 60%, cementing her as an above average killer after the changes. However, this was also the last update the Plague ever received. Despite this, her kill rate has steadily increased over time, indicating that while she might not be a popular pick, the ones that have stuck with her have mastered her. Unfortunately, the Plague's pick rate has seen a steep decline in recent time. While it is normal for pick rate to drop as new killers are added to the game, the Plague's pick rate has fallen by 50%, far more than the typical decline of around 25% seen with other killers released around this time. This disparity suggests that while she remains a solid killer, her unique playstyle have caused her to appeal to a smaller subset of players over the years. While her pick rate may have dwindled over the years, the Plague's impact on Dead by Daylight extends far beyond how often she's chosen. Her unique mechanics, lore, and design all left an undeniable mark on the future of the game's evolution. At the time of her release, most killers relied heavily on basic M1 attacks, with only a few exceptions like Huntress. The Plague broke this mold by introducing a completely new gameplay loop revolving around infection. This not only freshened up the game by introducing a new way to play, but also laid the groundworks for other infection-based abilities like Nemesis and Wesker. While Behavior couldn't have known this at the time, it is safe to say the Plague's mechanics inspired the design of some of Dead by Daylight's most iconic killers. Beyond gameplay, the Plague also marked a turning point for Dead by Daylight's lore. Behavior wanted their 10th chapter to revolve around a character from a completely different time epoch, so as to show that the entity can take anyone from anywhere at any time. This was in their eyes a way to build on the Dead by Daylight lore, whilst opening up endless possibilities for collaborations and inspirations. Needless to say, this worked pretty well. I mean, hell, we're gonna have Nicolas Cage being chased by Five Nights at Freddy's animatronics in Dead by Daylight soon, and it's not just mods this time. All of their existence in the Dead by Daylight universe is canon, and it's all thanks to the Plague. It's hard to overstate the Plague's legacy. Her inclusion helped Dead by Daylight evolve into the game it is today, in everything from gameplay mechanics and design to lore and storytelling. While her pick rate may have declined, her impact on the game remains. The Plague wasn't just a killer, she was a statement that Dead by Daylight could be anything, drawing from any place, any time, and any imagination.